They don't come here to attack us because we're rich and we're free. They come and they attack us because we're over there.
We don't need to go populist left or populist right. We don't need to embrace neo-Marxism or neo-fascism, these disastrous movements from the 20th century. Turns out the answer is pretty much our Bill of Rights, our story. Embrace freedom. That's the answer.
And if the LP has a purpose, it's not to put people to sleep. It's to wake them up.
We're here because we love liberty, and we're here because we hate injustice. We are here to save mankind. We are here to fight.
Join us, the Libertarian Party, in perhaps the most exciting, grandest endeavor in history, the restoration of American liberty.
Ideas spread, they can't stop them. An idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by any army or any government.
Hello and welcome to episode 89 of Decentralized Revolution, a podcast from the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus and Mises PAC. I'm Aaron Harris and I'm your host. One of my favorite guests is on the show today, Michael Rectenwald. He has been really prolific since kind of coming onto the libertarian scene a few years ago as the, I think his Twitter handle was like, anti-PC NYU prof or something like that. And from the very beginning, he's been very impressive, putting out all kinds of articles, books, talks, and he's got a book coming up on the Great Reset, and it's called The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty, Unraveling the Global Agenda. It is coming out in December. I think you can pre-order his book from his website, michaelrectenwald.com. We'll have a link to that on the show notes page at decentralizedrevolution.com/89. He's also written Springtime for Snowflakes, Social Justice and Its Postmodern Parentage, Google Archipelago, The Digital Gulag and Simulation of Freedom, Beyond Woke, which is the last thing I've completed by him, which is kind of a collection of different essays that I think they were kind of written like before, during, and after his sort of emergence onto the libertarian scene, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. He's got a novel called Thought Criminal, which is also very good. You can find all of that at his website through the link on the show notes page. And today I wanted to talk to him about the upcoming book. He's been making the rounds a lot, talking about the Great Reset in front of some conservative groups as well. And I just think he's always a very interesting guy. And I think that the whole World Economic Forum, Great Reset stuff is going to be a central topic of debate in American politics and world politics over the next few years. So nobody better than to brief us on what we need to do and what we need to be ready to understand and talk about to our neighbors than Michael Rectenwald. So I know you're going to enjoy this talk. Michael, it's great to have you on again. We were just talking off air. You had a bout with COVID several months ago and you're okay. And I really, really am happy about that because you're one of the greatest libertarian voices going right now at a time when we really need what you have to say. So it's good to see you, if not quite in person, at least visually. So
thank you so much, Aaron. Yeah, I'm doing well. Thank you.
That's really great. So you've been working on a book on the Great Reset for a little while. I know you've given a couple of talks about it at different places here recently. And I think it's really important that we talk about it as libertarians. It's going to be a big issue in elections and just in public life over the next few years, because I really think they're going to go for it. And one of the things that I think you're kind of implying, if you didn't explicitly say, I guess we could just start off by the part that the COVID stuff played in the Great Reset. Just start by talking about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is pretty evident. I mean, the Great Reset was launched technically as a response to the COVID crisis. So and it just so happened to affect the economic order in the ways that really the Great Reset would amount to. And that is, there's the Great Reset represents this tremendous consolidation of wealth and of production. And it does this through the means of stakeholder capitalism. And stakeholder capitalism is, it sounds like it's supposed to be good because it claims that, corporate behavior will not be just oriented to shareholders or profit, but to all stakeholders. But really what it amounts to is making corporate participants like stakeholders in the economy. And it effectively drives out all competition that is not involved in the stakeholder model. So it's really a consolidation or a shared monopoly scheme. So the COVID crisis lent itself to this kind of consolidation because what it did is drove out of business all these small and medium-sized companies. Millions were lost over this. Millions of businesses closed. 60 to 75% of them never to reopen. And at the same time, you had this massive consolidation of wealth amongst the super corporate players like Amazon and Walmart and Facebook and all the big tech, Apple. They had record profits through all this. And while at the same time, all these small businesses and medium-sized businesses were shuttered. So this is really what the Great Reset brings about. And then there's some curiosities regarding the COVID crisis with reference to this. There were there were 36 total pandemic simulations that were run before COVID-19, but 2 of them involved the World Economic Forum, which is the main organizing body of this Great Reset. And that was the CLADEX and Event 201 simulation scenarios. And those simulations basically, in the responses to this pandemic, this so-called faux pandemic of the simulations, everything that took place with COVID really was precast. It was basically given away. So in effect, you could look at it 2 ways. One, these pandemic simulations were basically training for government officials to behave in a particular way when the COVID crisis hit. And as such, they basically told these government officials to enact lockdowns, to censor social media, to flood social and legacy media with authoritative sources. But they also forecasted the mass unemployment, the riots, and we saw that in the Summer of Love 2020. So this has led some people to, I don't go there, but this has led some people to suggest that, this pandemic was planned by the World Economic Forum. I mean, look, it doesn't matter in a way, because what happened is that they acted they got these governments to act in ways which led to this massive crisis, the COVID crisis, which is the responses by the state and various states to the crisis, to the COVID virus. So, yeah, I mean, it really was a launch of the Great Reset. It really literally launched it.
When a couple of weeks into the COVID thing, after the 15 days to flatten the curve, at first I was like, I don't know about this. My parents are in their 70s. I'm mildly worried. And then after that couple of weeks, I was like, okay, the Simon Says aspect of it just kept kind of striking me. It's like, oh, we're doing this today, now we're doing that tomorrow. And it seemed to me, and I remember telling my wife, I was like, this seems like a dress rehearsal of them seeing what they can not only train the, government officials and the media to do, but just to see what people would put up with. I got that vibe very strongly.
Very much so. I had a conversation at the beginning of the pandemic with my oldest son, who has since become a libertarian thanks to the COVID crisis. But I said to him, he said, I said, I'm not worried about this virus. This was probably about a week into it. I'm worried about what the state's going to do in response to this virus. And he goes, what do you mean the state's going to save us? I said, oh, no, the state is going to ruin us. And he saw this since subsequently, and as such has come around to our thinking in terms of what the state is, which is our foremost enemy.
Well, in the state, they throughout history, and I can think of, I think Rahm Emanuel was Obama's chief of staff for a while, and he had a famous quote that made it into the debate for a while of, hey, never let an opportunity, never let a crisis go to waste, right? So like whether it was, planned or orchestrated, or they could have stopped it better, but they let it
right.
No matter what it was, they're like, oh, whether it was happenstance or planned, it was a crisis that they could take advantage of.
Yeah, that's how I leave it, because I don't want to get into, by the way, my book is finished and it's now available for pre-order on my website. It's called The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty, Unraveling the Global Agenda. And one of the things that I have in the book is that there's a recent study that came out that showed a correspondence between the trained young global leaders of the World Economic Forum and the most draconian responses to the COVID crisis. And as it turns out, where there was a greater concentration of young global leaders in a particular country and region, there were a corresponding response to the COVID crisis that was more draconian in terms of lockdowns and so forth, masking, social distancing, all of that. So they trained these people to respond this way to the crisis. And, Chrystia Freeland, who's in Canada, she's got a position of, she just basically recently changed positions, but she's like in direct head of finance or something like that. She's the one who laughed when she told the press that they were going to confiscate the bank, lock the bank accounts of the truckers during the trucker convoy protest. She was trained up as a young global leader, for example. And she ran the response of Canada to the COVID crisis too.
Well, this is a good time to talk about some of that backstory on the World Economic Forum, and in particular, kind of their strategy for recruiting and placing people. So, tell us about where that got started, what the WEF is, and how long ago, and how long they've been doing this, and to get their people into place.
Yeah. So starting with the World Economic Forum, it's an international NGO based in Geneva, and they run their annual meetings in Davos, and they've been in existence since 1972 as the European Management Forum, and then they became the World Economic Forum in, I think, 87 or 85. I can't remember exactly. But in any case, they're now they build themselves as the public-private institution, the public-private NGO. They're basically about coordinating corporations and major private interests in their agenda, the Davos agenda. which has now been renamed the Great Reset. So the Young Global Leaders was formally founded in 2004 and then had their first meeting in 2005. They began with some 290 initiates, and there are now about 1,400 total young global leaders who have been trained up through this process. They go to Davos, they have special meetings. They're effectively indoctrinated, if they're not already believers, in all of the agenda, and that includes the climate catastrophism, as I call it, climate change catastrophism agenda, and this centralized type of intergovernmental rule. So the Great Resetters, the World Economic Forum, not only gets these corporations enlisted into the stakeholder capitalism mode and model, they also conceive of this new form of governance, which is public-private partnerships. And this is where they enlist these corporate partners into governance. And this is happening vis-a-vis the UN, because the WEF has a partnership with the UN, which they signed in 2019. And so that partnership was to affect the sustainability goals of Agenda 2030. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you've ever looked at Agenda 2030. Basically, this is about intergovernmental governance. And so what they do is they're demanding all these types of responses to poverty, to the climate crisis, to reproduction, and all this. And these sustainability goals are to be met by 2030. And it really involves a lot of welfare to developing countries from the developed world. Effectively, it amounts to bribes paid from the developed to the developing world in order to keep the developing world from developing. Mm-hmm. It's that simple. They don't want them to industrialize, so they bribe these nation states to keep them from industrializing, because they don't want them to engage in unsustainable industry. So that's a large part of what they're about. And the UN, of course, that's their agenda, is effectively controlling production and consumption. They're very big on the reduced consumption amongst the so-called developed nations, and equity. Mm-hmm. And equity and sustainability are intimately connected. In order to be sustainable, they say, you have to have equity. In order to have equity, it has to be sustainable. And what they mean by that is simply, you got to give money from the developed to the undeveloped world so that they don't develop into the developed world, because that would be a crisis. That would exacerbate the climate crisis, supposedly. And so the WEF's in a partnership. They're bringing their corporate partners to the table. There are over 1,000 major corporations signed on to the WEF as corporate partners. And mm-hmm. these are companies committed to the stakeholder capitalism model. And the main means for driving home stakeholder capitalism is through ESG, the Environmental, Social, and Governance Index. And they have many companies signed on to their version of the ESG, which is about, sustainable production, cutting fossil fuels everywhere as possible, having social justice in the boardroom and in the management and in the composition of the employees and so forth. And governance really refers to the transparency of these companies to mm-hmm. the public, and how well they cooperate with the state, frankly.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about There's a couple of different ways I want to go there. First of all, the sustainability thing that they talk about, do they get into, you hear a lot of their rhetoric. What's the guy, Yuval Harari, I think his name
Harari.
is Harari, yeah.
Yeah.
From him and some other people that are really very anti-human,
Yeah.
Orwellian, Huxleyan, whatever type stuff. Like, do they have stated goals on population? Do they say, hey, we just want to stop the population from growing, or do they explicitly say, Earth should only have 1 billion people or whatever?
Well, that's a very good question. And I track the history of the UN's population agenda, which took place through major population conferences that began in the early 70s and all the way up to, the present day. So they used to really advocate straight up sterilizing people, forced abortions, and things like this. They literally do in their own writing. Julian Huxley, you mentioned Huxley. He was the first director of UNESCO. He was a eugenicist and Malthusian, neo-Malthusian, a population ethicist. We have to have the population under control. So they've been always very much about controlling population. But in the course of these conferences, these population conferences, UN population conferences, they shifted their rhetoric to human rights and reproductive rights. But reproductive rights, and then also when they talk about equality, gender equality, they mean fostering the careerism of women, and they only have really one reason to do that, and that is for population. Right. So they're always about pushing women as, in careers and careerism and advancement for women because they want them not to reproduce.
Yep.
And so that's, of course, what is meant by reproductive rights. It's not the right to reproduce. It's the right not to reproduce. It's the right to have abortions and other types of controls over reproduction. They don't target any specific number of people on the planet, but they have been contributed to by the UN and the WF have been really close cognates with the Club of Rome, which was very much a population ethicist organization, a neo-Malthusian organization, with the Bilderberg Group. All of these people, and I tracked all this in the book. There's like memberships of people in the WEF overlap with memberships in the UN, with memberships in the Bilderberg Group, with memberships in the Club of Rome. All these globalist organizations are very incestuous, and it's the same people in all these places over and over and over.
Mm-hmm.
So, the Great Reset really is a long-standing project and has the endorsement of the UN, of the Club of Rome, of the Bilderberg Group, of the Council of Foreign Relations, of the Chatham House Group, and of the Trilateral Commission.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're all bedfellows. I mean, these are really close bedfellows. So I forget exactly how we took off into this, but I think we were saying, the population. Yeah, they don't have specific targets.
Yeah,
but they definitely have over the decades. They have promoted population control, and they've forced sterilization and forced abortion were not off the table.
Mm-hmm.
These were things they advocated over the years.
Yeah. And I think that also, a lot of the gender ideology stuff is obviously going right in along with the so-called reproductive rights, which again, as libertarians, like if people want to freely choose to not have children, to be gay, to be trans or whatever, like that's totally fine. But it is troubling to me that the state and people working along with the state are going all in on this push to do things that it's one thing if like some of their policies would discourage reproduction and families, but some of them didn't. And it was just, it's just happenstance. But when every one of their policies has a pretty clear link to, we don't want people in stable families having children, like you start to see that is a that's a really huge part of it. And I think that, James Lindsay has talked about the kind of one of the goals of the gender ideology, and even to some extent, the racial CRT stuff, is to give people an identity without an essence, that they belong to some sort of, group, but that, it's a social group that's not very concrete. They don't belong to, their family or their church or their local town or whatever. They identify with a sort of an abstract idea, and those people are kind of pretty much docile consumers and voters, right?
Yeah. This is, yeah, they promote this. It's not as if this is just like an option. This is something that's strongly recommended and strongly promoted, and they're definitely, I think, involved in trying to debase the family, trying to encourage transgenderism, which I think debases the family. If you can get rid of the primary constituents of the family, then you get rid of the family. And I think this is one of the major things. And this is a statist thing all the way through. Statists have always tried to get rid of the family because the family represents an impediment, an obstacle, and a buffer between the state and the individual. This is why in Marx's in Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto, they advocated the abolition of the family. So this has been a very constant refrain for these people all the way down. And I've worked on looking at that history in great depth in the book.
Yeah. Another thing that we've already touched on that I really want to get into, and I've really learned a lot about the last few months, is the ESG stuff. And of course, when it's funny whenever sort of normies like to critique libertarians, they always say, oh, they love Ayn Rand and they love big business and all this stuff. But like every libertarian I know is very anti-big business because of how the economy is structured now. And talk about how okay, so if these companies were just naked capitalists who just wanted to make money, they probably wouldn't go along with some of this stuff. But with the ESG stuff and the fact that we have central banking, talk about how that makes it, not only is it politically, maybe their ideology is left, but the fact that there's now a financial incentive that actually makes their companies more viable by doing things that their consumers would probably hate. So how does that work?
Well, I talk about it in terms of a woke cartel is really what it is. This is a cartel, and this cartel aims to drive out competitors by virtue of eliminating them from the productive spheres through this ESG, the environmental, social, and governance score. It's a demarcation device by which to divide the wheat from the chaff. The wheat is the woke corporate players, and the chaff would be the unwoke. It's definitely directed against small and middle-sized businesses because the compliance is so difficult to maintain, and it's expensive to have all this kind of ESG reporting. So as they drive it further and further down the economic chain, it's going to, if it continues, that is, it's going to drive a lot of companies out of business. And they're also, so it's having major effects on investment as it is. As you know, the major three investment companies, asset managers, that is BlackRock, State Street, and the Vanguard Group, control $22 trillion worth of capital. And they invest along these ESG lines largely. And this is a way of starving off competitors. First of all, the main group that they're trying to starve off is the oil industry, although only in the West. It's a very curious thing. And only in the West do these ESGs really perform this differential prejudice. And it's also a massive infringement on property rights, because you're telling a company how they must operate, how many such and such employees of whatever constitution, genetically or identity wise, you must have, whether you can engage in this or that type of productive enterprise, what kind of raw materials you can use, just all of these restrictions on the behavior of companies basically infringes their rights, and it's a form of economic fascism, because you have this cartel dictating in connection with the state. But this is a very strange amalgam. It's an extra state, extra governmental. It's an extra governmental mechanism, because it's operating in advance of state dictates at this time.
Yeah.
Now the states are catching up to it, and they're starting to institute laws and so forth that will be in line with this. But the corporations, through this stakeholder and ESG mechanism, are getting out ahead of state legislation.
Well, but hey, they're private companies. What's wrong with all these private companies getting together to decide how they're going to invest, right? So
right, but not only how they're going to invest, but how everyone else is going to operate.
Yeah,
that's the thing. It is dictatorial over the operations of other corporations, and those that are getting in line are effectively saying, "Look, we want to be in the cartel rather than out of it, because being in the cartel has advantages." This is why I say it is not go woke and go broke. This is a fallacious conception. It is go woke or go broke at this juncture. In the long run, it's of course going to be go broke, because this is going to fail miserably. We're already seeing the effects of this in our economy today, especially with the prices of gas, oil, and other fossil fuel-based energy sources, electricity through coal.
Yep.
I mean, all of this is going to destroy the economy if this continues, and it'll ravage the economic sphere and the personal finances of billions. So, it has to be stopped. There has to be a way to stop it. I've put together a 9-point plan for doing so. It's not a silver bullet. There is no silver bullet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely one place I want to go, but I want to talk just a little bit more about how what I think is going to succeed for them in the short run, but not in the medium or long run, is again, like the fact that the banks and these big asset managers, they're the ones that are closest to the money printing machine.
Mm-hmm.
So when the money gets printed,
goes to them
digitally,
first.
It goes to them first, and they at zero or near zero interest rates. It's like me borrowing money from you at zero interest and then loaning it to Jim at 10% interest. Like, you see what's going on there. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that if it weren't for the Federal Reserve and being able to decide who's first in line to get that new money, then this wouldn't be such a great weapon for them, right?
That's right. And I should make note that Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, is a major influencer and consultant for the Fed. Mm-hmm. And so he's having, and they're adopting his policies that he recommends. So there's another form of collusion here. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the money gets first, it gets streamlined, and it gets directed at the proper ESG abiding companies through the Fed, and they basically as you pointed out, they first fund those companies and so forth that they want to thrive, and they make the rest wait, and we get the higher interest rates and the The higher interest rates, first of all, because they're, over printing, of course, that they're producing inflation directly. And then, of course, based on the fact that the first move, the first shake, and the rest pay the higher rates, it compounds that interest, so to speak.
You've done a lot of work, even as far back as like the Google Archipelago book, which I think is 4 years old or so at this point.
Yeah.
About how we can really look at the difference between, what is truly a private company, which we as libertarians, again, today, a lot of private companies still play the government game. I saw it as a newspaper reporter at the local level of, when a chain store, wanted to come in and, CVS wanted to build a drugstore, they got all the zoning exceptions pretty quickly and pretty easily. Whereas, mom and pop restaurant who wanted to have a larger sign, well, that sign's too big,
Yeah.
So these private companies do use government, but there's what you've kind of teased out, kind of the term, governmentalities and capitalism with Chinese characteristics. How do we, as libertarians who want to protect, private enterprise, no matter how big they are,
Right.
if they're doing it ethically, versus what we see now? Because we see there's a hardcore element of libertarians who I think just kind of have their head in the sand. I think they're a minority among libertarians, but every time, social media censorship comes up, and it's not technically censorship, kind of. I know it
is now. I can tell you why.
Right. Talk about why. Yeah.
Well, it's because they're being directed by the state to censor directly now. They're as we saw with we found out that there were direct communications between the Biden administration officials and Facebook and Twitter, telling them effectively what accounts to censor. They called them, there's some number of the biggest offenders, and they wanted them shut down. They dictate, what is disinformation, and then these social media companies effectively basically are at their beck and call to do what exactly they say. So the way I understand it, and one of the things to get at here is starting off with the fact that these companies were state agents in the first place, a lot of them. Specifically, Google and Facebook, they received their startup money through In-Q-Tel, which is the private investment arm of the CIA. And that was direct in the case of Google. That's where their startup money came from, and that it was indirect in the case of Facebook, but it went through companies that got their startup money from In-Q-Tel. So that's the origin story. Now, some would say, well, that's a genetic fallacy to go from there and saying they're not private companies. Okay, well, let's talk about all their government contracts. They have, Google has endless government contracts, and furthermore, let's talk about their cooperation with the intelligence agencies. For example, the NSA, who has backdoor access to all these social media sites, and that's granted to them by these social media companies. And Google was invented as a CIA tool in the first place. It was a means of gathering information. They saw the internet as this massive database that based on user inputs that never had existed. And so here, what they had to, they looked for a way to tap into this resource, and they found, this startup Google at Stanford, and they effectively got them off the ground. So, and they're state apparatuses because they function for the state. They have state their provenance is from the state, and they do state functions. They carry out state functions regularly.
And that's the problem with corporatism or fascism or, whatever you want to call it, is even a company that may have started off as purely a good capitalist enterprise if it gets to the point where either A, the government has a gun to their head and says, we will regulate you, we will sue you if you don't do this, or if the government is bribing them saying, we'll give you special favors, shut out your competitors, or if it's the companies who own the government, right? So in any of those scenarios, and I think a lot of scenarios is probably a mix of all three.
Yeah.
That
there's carrot and stick.
It's like which way, where did it start? But a key, if the state is making decisions, and if decisions are being made based on cooperation with the state and what they're going to get out of them, well, at that point, whose fault it is you can tease that out. But what is happening is the state is being used to further someone's interest, whether it's the state or the company. So as libertarians, if someone is cooperating so closely with the state that we can't really tell who's driving, then clearly we're allowed to oppose that as libertarians. It's not purely private marketplace action taking place. It's so obvious to me.
Yeah, it's not private market. This is not the free market at all.
Yeah.
This is even cartelization is not the free market, because in effect, when these corporations form this kind of a cartel that get together as a kind of mob, right, that then mobs on and controls the behavior of other corporations, they do that with the implicit endorsement of the state, if not its explicit endorsement and support. So the cartel movement, I think, and the woke cartel is a statist regime, and there's no way that you can say that these are acting in good faith, free market good faith principles.
Yeah,
not at all.
Even guys like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, who sometimes sound very libertarian, and maybe they are, but if you look at where their investments and where their contracts are, they do a lot of contracts with the state and even with like defense and intelligence stuff. So like, that's the thing, is even if these guys are, somewhat libertarian or good-ish conservatives at heart, the fact that they're not willing to say no to these government contracts, it really makes me suspicious of anything they might want to do. It's very dangerous to me.
Yeah, Peter Thiel's has been funded by In-Q-Tel. His companies have been funded by In-Q-Tel directly. In fact, he was one of the liaisons between In-Q-Tel and Facebook. So he's not, these guys, Musk and Thiel, they're very mixed bags. In a way, I think Musk holds out some possibility of defecting entirely from the woke state corporate hybrid cartel, but he is obviously not a free market libertarian hero. I certainly, he's in the crosshairs of the woke cartel, based on his venture to purchase Twitter, and the threat that poses to this cartel and the state's endorsement of it.
Yeah. So right before I went on, I texted a couple of people to say, hey, what do you want me to ask Michael Rectenwald? And one of those was Angela McCardle. And she asked, hey, how do we oppose the Great Reset, the WEF, on a practical level? You said that that's some of that is going to be in your book, and there's no magic bullet. But what can people start doing? And as libertarians, because we're ahead of the curve on this, and we see what's coming, what should we be telling our friends and neighbors to prepare for, so that when things do happen, they're like, oh, those guys were right.
Yeah, I have a 9-point plan for stopping the Great Reset.
Okay.
And I'll just spill it out. I won't go into all the subpoints, but the first thing is, of course, it's going to be refuse central bank digital currency, because this will represent total surveillance over spending, savings, and debt. And it involves, having an account with the Fed, in effect, is what this will mean. And the Fed will have all of your transactions will be transparent to the Fed, and could be controlled in some cases if you become a deplorable, for about lack of a better word.
Yep.
Your spending in certain areas or all areas could be cut off.
Yeah.
There's so many things that are wrong with CBDCs that I can't list them all, but that's some of them. And then some of these other technologies that are coming down the pipe, like the Internet of Bodies technologies and the installation of devices in your body and the participation in the metaverse, and all these transhumanist technologies, I would say we have to, at this juncture, reject their use because they are not being wielded for enhancement of human beings. They are going to be wielded as means of control. Even wearable devices on your body to monitor your heart rate or other types of organ system monitoring. We don't want that because it's going off to central databases.
Is that what's meant by Internet of Bodies? The fact that people have these devices that track where they are and what they're
yes. They'll be like location devices, and they could even be internal. They're talking about implants of all sorts and nanotechnology to use brain cloud to create brain cloud interfaces. It's very, very otherworldly sounding in effect, but all of this stuff is very much on the table, and the technologies have been developed. So I think we need to reject this stuff as it is right now. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not anti-technology. It is because of the means, the people that are in control of this technology and their objectives for using it are very suspect, to say the least.
Yep.
That is with the Internet of Bodies. Then, of course, there's digital identity, which is a very pernicious development. I think we have to reject digital identity. This is a database for each person, effectively a catalog, a database on all of your activity. It is not a means of identification, as bad as those are, as it is, in a way, these state IDs. This is a complete profile of the individual. And if we let this this incursion into our behavior take place under these circumstances, we're talking about tracking, tracing, and surveilling people from cradle to grave.
Yep.
And then, of course, this shouldn't be news to anybody listening. Practice the free market. We may be a remnant that is trying to keep the free market alive. So we have to practice it ourselves. And that means disengagement from most establishment institutions, I must say. But it also means, eliminating dependence on the state and so forth, obviously, and, entrepreneurship and the possibility of parallel economies and so forth should not be discounted at all.
Right. Agorism and things like that. Yeah.
Another thing is, this is not point number 5 now, is divest from ESG stocks and electronically traded ESG funds that include ESG index stocks.
Okay.
I don't know if people are in the market. Get out of the ESG because it's part of the cartel scheme. You're feeding the beast.
Yep.
And get money out of ESG reporting banks, which is very difficult because most of them are, especially the large ones. And Bank of America is the leading edge of this movement. And they're going to start, they already are, basing their investments on how ESG compliant you are or your company is. So if your company is not ESG abiding, and this is straight out of the mouth of the CEO of Bank of America, Brian Moynihan, who said, if you do not meet the stakeholder bar or the ESG bar, you don't deserve loans, he said straight up. And they're going to start throwing people out of their banks based on certain behaviors. And right now, it's already happening in terms of political or rhetorical matters, like in the case of Ye or Ya or whatever it is.
Kanye West, is that?
Kanye West, yeah.
Yeah.
Yay, that's what it is. It's yay, not ye.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
Week, right?
But this could penetrate further into other behaviors than just speech, like, ESG abiding, whether you're sort of ESG abiding.
Or if you don't pay for your employees' abortions or whatever. Yeah.
All that kind of stuff. Plus, whether you have exceeded your carbon footprint allowance.
Yep.
And then some of this stuff now is not going to be that appealing to libertarians because we don't care for the state. But now, I think it was Rothbard that said, if you can use the state to dismantle the state, you need to do that. So I think we need to really pressure the state not to fund the World Economic Forum and other tentacles of the World Economic Forum, because these people they're dictating, policy, and it's statist and it's extra statist at the same time. But the more prevalent it becomes in the corporate realm, the more it'll be adopted by states and turned into policies. And in the case of the Biden administration, it's executive orders to demand, certain types of investment along ESG lines. That's already out in the Biden Executive Order 14,030. And then, these states, and some of them are starting to do it, and they need to withdraw their pension monies out of ESG investing asset managers. And so I think the states these representatives need to be pressured to do this. And I think we need to encourage the defection of elites from the globalist agenda. That means, like, there have to be elites that they're on the fence, or they're not quite sure of their position with reference to all this, that if they could defect from this based on moral, ethical, and economic grounds, then this would help to break up this movement, because this cartel movement is extremely, pernicious. And then lastly, is network with like-minded individuals to spread this plan or addendums to it or whatever you want that work along these lines to stop this movement. Yeah. Because it's, from the libertarian standpoint, it's statist in the sense that it's operating like a state, like states, and it's going to enroll and enlist more state partners as it goes.
Yeah. And I guess as one of the key things that the Mises Caucus wants to do is, encourage political decentralization, where, one of our things has been working for, candidates or ballot measures who would say, okay, this is going to be a Second Amendment sanctuary county, like where I am in Knox County, Tennessee, like that could possibly happen here. Whereas, in the county where Nashville is, it's much more Democrat, and the city here in Knoxville is very Democrat, but everybody else, it's very red. And so this could be a county sanctuary. In other places, to completely legalize drugs in a county or a state, and to tell the federal government to go pound sand. Like, do you see any opportunities for political decentralization to work against this too? If a state or a city tried to, what could they do?
Yeah, I think state and city decentralization works against this by virtue of blocking it from entrance into that locality. Yeah. This could, involves, for example, these pensions that are invested through these asset managers to divest from these asset managers entirely, but also to not go along with the ESG type arrangements according to the UN and Agenda 2030 and Agenda 21, which are to reorganize how cities and localities are built and how they operate, like they want them to operate like smart cities with total surveillance and control over all resources.
Mm-hmm.
So anything that stops that and allows people to independently and autonomously operate as much as possible without this kind of interference is absolutely good. I mean, it always comes down to the local, of course, because that's where everything happens.
Yeah. So
any kinds of decentralization with barriers or strongholds, is definitely definitely along the lines of what we want to do.
And another thing that I think is encouraging is that occasionally we see that when politicians are willing and able to stand up against this sort of thing, they are often rewarded. I mean, I don't know much about this Giorgia Meloni over in Italy. I think she's going to become the next prime minister, and I've seen a couple clips of her like explicitly sort of calling out, the global financial elite on what they do to keep at, she's supposedly a fascist and a racist, but she's talking about ending neocolonialism in Africa, where the financial elites loan them this money to control them and all that. So that's a funny form of fascism, if you ask me. She may be bad on some things I don't know.
You're right.
But the fact that some of the, I think some of the Trump DeSantis type Republicans might be amenable to this message. What are you seeing? Are there people who are standing up to this, and what? How do we know if they're? Should we support them even if they're bad on other things? Like, what's going on electorally, and is there anybody who's building anything organized? Basis?
I mean, 19 governors wrote a letter to BlackRock Inc., for example, suggesting that we will not accept your ESG oriented investment strategies because they are not in the interests of our pension holders. And so they want, and then many states, Louisiana just has pulled out some $800 billion from BlackRock, and they're not letting them invest. As far as who's coming up on the electoral map, I'm not au courant on who's running for what. I just don't operate at that level too much. But I would say anybody that's trying to oppose this ESG is good for our purposes at the time, because this has a massive implications for deindustrializing the West to the point where, would send us back to, listen, if they had enacted the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, we'll be living in Victorian in the pre-Victorian age, pre-industrial revolution conditions.
Yeah, it's going to be a weird transition because some of those things are going to be limping along, but a lot of things would revert to 200 years ago fairly quickly.
It would be the most bizarre amalgam of things. Like, you'd have this high-tech, surveillance on the one hand while you're burning, logs for heat on the other. Well,
how does the old joke go? What did socialists use for light before candles? Well, the light bulb, right?
Yeah.
They went backwards. And so, and that's, I guess, one thing maybe we can end on this is kind of a returning to, like, what is kind of motivating these people? Like is Klaus Schwab the one really, is he the puppet master, or is this just like, a bunch of bankers, like, they don't care really what happens, but they see this as a good play and they like being in control? Like, what's motivating people, and who's really pulling the strings on this? Is it, or is that even a worthy question to ask?
No, that's a worthy question. I get it often. I mean, you could look at the WEF and Klaus Schwab as kind of like I put it in this form, and I don't know if people don't like football, but too bad. I guess I'll put it in this way anyway. They're the quarterback, okay? They're not the owner of the team. They're not the general manager. They're not the coach. but they're executing the plays and the playbook. They're carrying out the kinds of things that whoever is at the top is really dictating.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really their function. And I think ultimately it ties back to the banks, the International Bank of Settlements and the IMF and the World Bank are effectively going to be the ones funding and directing the funding of all this. So banks in the end will be the main, ultimate control factor. But it's like this: if there's without even having to identify the puppet masters, all we need to do is cut the strings. It doesn't matter who's pulling them as long as they're not there. So if you cut the strings, it doesn't matter who these puppet masters are.
Yeah. And I think a big part of that is us educating ourselves on that and speaking out against it. And so it's one thing to, after something happens, to say, oh, well, this is why that happened.
Mm-hmm.
But because people, as libertarians, we often face my wife is not very political. And so sometimes she's like struggling to understand why I'm saying something happened or whatever. But when I kind of predict it and it happens, that I get some credibility, there. So I think that we need to start putting this out there. And, we always got to remember that, the whole term conspiracy theorist was coined by the CIA to discredit people.
Yes, it was. I have a whole chapter on that in my book, how this conspiracy theory nonsense got started. It was Karl Popper, first of all, with his Open Society and Its Enemies book, and then the CIA co-opted this phraseology for its use.
I didn't know that about Popper. I knew a little bit about him from my time the first time I was in grad school. So, I'll be looking forward to that book. So, so you're right. It doesn't matter who it is. We just have to speak out against it and hope enough people will listen. And when things happen, that we'll get some credibility based on that. But, and then one other thing that we kind of briefly touched on is at some point, the central banking aspect of this is going to come into play as far as a real collapse. I think they're really walking a tightrope with what they're doing with inflation, and if a crash happens, could that be more of an opportunity for them? Or I think that we're really heading into a very interesting time.
That's when they'll rush in the CBDCs as a necessary palliative to address the crisis and start issuing something like UBI. And that's where we got to stop them. I mean, we really don't. This is what I mean by pulling the string. So if they have a string on your arm, just don't move your arm the way they want you to. Yeah. I mean, it's really, it's actually kind of I call it a grand refusal. So you have to know what they're trying to get you to do, and then do something else, And
at least make it as difficult as possible for them to do it. They may go ahead and do it, but if you, if you don't lay over, they gotta start chewing on you, and they're either gonna, they're gonna defeat you, or they're gonna have to spit you out. So you just got to make it tough for them to, instead of going along the first time when they ask you to, I don't know, do something like take a medication you don't want. Some people weren't able to hold out because literally their jobs were at stake. And, I'm blessed that I have a situation where we didn't have to make that decision. But even the people who did give in, the fact that a lot of people dragged their feet, tried to get exemptions, like all of that, I think it made it harder for them to implement, and then made it a little easier for them to, more likely for them to give up a little sooner. So that's the key, is to not, the first time they tell you to do something, at the very least, you got to put up some sort of questioning or resistance, or else
absolutely
you're just going to encourage more orders. So
exactly.
Just tell us a little bit more. The book's coming up. When's it going to be available? What else are you doing? Are there people should be aware of? How can they connect? All of that good stuff.
Okay, well, everything, the connecting part is all through my website, michaelrectenwald.com. The book will be out it's up for pre-order now. It'll be out for delivery in December, hopefully before Christmas, for those who pre-order it from me, which I encourage for numerous reasons. One of them being that Amazon is part of the woke cartel. Mm-hmm. And it's called The Great Reset and the Struggle for Liberty: Unraveling the Global Agenda. It's got a forward from Lou Rockwell, so I have that endorsement, and it is it treats in depth all the components of the Great Reset, the economic system that it establishes, a deep history of the World Economic Forum, and the population control ethics of the WEF and all these globalist organizations, the climate change catastrophist movement, and it goes right after the climate change narrative. Yeah. And then all the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution are treated, and the question of conspiracy theory is treated directly.
Okay.
And that includes this 9-point plan for stopping it as part of what I call the Grand Refusal. So it's a thoroughly sourced, not conspiratorial rant. It's a thoroughly sourced account of all this. It lays it bare, I think, the premises and implications of the Great Reset Project.
Yeah, I really am looking forward to it. I've read a couple of your books, and I'm just amazed. When I first heard about you, I was like, oh, this guy can't be that great. He's probably just a grouchy professor who didn't like the PC stuff, but he's probably not that great. But it turns out that you proved me wrong. When I first started listening to you and reading your stuff, I'm like, oh yeah, this guy's good. And you just keep putting stuff out. Even in a year where you got sick, you kept working. And so you put a lot of younger libertarians to shame with your output. And so I really, really appreciate that. And thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
And there you have it. I'd like to thank Michael Rectenwald for his time and wisdom. And just, man, that guy has got quite a work routine down, as much as he puts out, and really proud to have him on the show. You can find out more about him, links to some of the stuff we talked about, his books, etc., over at the show notes page, decentralizedrevolution.com/89. Thanks to my co-producer, Simon Kalpin, and thanks to Dave versus Goliath for all the music you hear on Decentralized Revolution. And thanks to everyone who subscribes to our email list and gives to Mises PAC at takehumanaction.com. And also, I always thank people who share, rate, review, and subscribe to Decentralized Revolution. If you haven't done that or haven't done that for a while, like our YouTube channel with the Mises Caucus, rate the podcast, share it. Also check out Ask an Austrian, the podcast, which is on all the same podcatchers as this one. And thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.